I think we can all recognize that LeBron James has a unique set of physical attributes. He, you, I, we're all unique in some way. But how was LeBron James made? How did he come to be the way that he is? We find several biblical authors attributing our origins to God's act of knitting us together in our mother's womb. Can we find and see such evidence of divine action? Let's explore these questions within the context of asking, are God's knitting needles revealed in the creation of LeBron James? We've got that coming up next. Before I get started here, let me tell you sort of the outline of what I'm going to do here. I have about 15 minutes worth of prepared remarks. While I'm giving those remarks, I've got this little slideshow going next to me, and that's a bunch of artificial intelligence generated images of LeBron James and formation of man from clay. All right, so a little something to look at besides my face. And after I'm done with that 15 to 20 minutes or so of prepared remarks, I will then go into a kind of a long, more speculative, off the top of my head, free-flowing discussion of free will, chance, answers in Genesis, creationism, and so forth, and how all this kind of fits into maybe a bigger picture. The satire site, The Babylon Bee, recently published a fictional piece in which Ken Ham claimed that Mike Trout's amazing baseball abilities were the very best evidence for intelligent design. The Bee's satire, got me thinking about the nature of God's contingent actions in this world, which have traditionally been identified as special providence, miracles, and creative acts. I think all Christians would affirm that God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, made Mike Trout. But let's change our focus to LeBron James, who is maybe better known, and also he happens to be from the city where I currently work, Akron, Ohio. We could make the very same claim about LeBron James that, say, the psalmist made about our own origins. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Psalm 139:13. Or as Job responds to God in Job 10:11, you clothed me with skin and flesh and knit me together my bones and sinews. Hence, the Christian can confidently proclaim that LeBron James, you, and I were all the product of a process that we could generally call intelligent design. I don't think not to be, though, confused with the more narrow meaning of those who subscribe to a specific movement called ID or intelligent design. But just how did God make LeBron James? Let's just sit back and think about that for a moment. What does it mean that God knit one of us together in our mother's womb? I think it's safe to assume that all Christians believe that the physical body of LeBron James is not the product of a direct de novo creation. He had parents from whom he obtained his physical and personality traits, ostensibly through the instruction shared by his parents, through the donation of their genomic information. Not only that, we all recognize that his parents had parents, and we can continue to go back many, many generations. Moving back in time, we can confidently say that you and I, LeBron James, and all the people alive today, we all share a common ancestor at some point in the past. Just how far in the past, well, that's a subject to quite a bit of debate. But for some Christians, they would identify the ancestral father of each of us in the person of maybe Noah, maybe 4,350 years ago. Others believe that the common ancestor might be much further back in time, or maybe possibly found even more recently. While we might disagree about the exact date of our common ancestry, we can all agree that, in fact, we do share a common father and a common mother, although positions kind of differ about whether those two parents existed at the very same time. Now, a more provocative question than did God create and make LeBron James might be, if you were to follow LeBron James' ancestors all the way back to our shared ancestor, how would we characterize God's mode of action through Mr. James' ancestral lineage to the very present day person of LeBron James? In other words, how did God act? How did God actually do it? Like make LeBron James? I'm confident the LeBron James genome, or you might say genetic blueprint, it's utterly unique. No person before him, or that will come after him, will be exactly like him. And yet you and I and LeBron James were all made from an ancestral genetic blueprint that's found in our common ancestor. At a minimum, I think we can all agree that if we were to examine LeBron James' genome, we would discover that he has alleles, or we call variations of genes, and say genomic rearrangements, the structures of his chromosomes, that are utterly unique to LeBron James himself and maybe his immediate ancestors, compared to the variation that exists in any ancestor you or I might share with him. These new alleles, or unique structural rearrangements, where do they come from? Well, they're the result of mutations, which we could broadly define as any change in the sequence of DNA code or order or the composition of the genome. We could ask at this point, should we expect to find a signature of divine intervention, like miracles or special creative acts, at any specific moment in time that resulted in LeBron James's specific combinations of genes and exceptional skill set? Or would we need only to apply to God's faithful and ongoing, special, potentially measurable providence to make LeBron James? Special providence might include God's bringing about a whole series of events through what John Garvey has termed the causes in nature to achieve his desired purpose at a specific time. And I'll put that link to an article that I found very helpful on his article on divine modes of action. Or you might be content to describe LeBron James solely by general providence, the general unfolding by God of the laws of nature, from which LeBron James is but one possible outcome of many possible outcomes. Now, how any Christian responds to these questions, it's going to be likely tied to a person's theological viewpoint on topics such as the origin of living things and human beings in particular, the doctrine of free will, God's sovereignty, the doctrine of providence. And in traditional Christian Protestant and in particular Calvinistic theology, and in light of the verses mentioned above, such as Psalm 139:9, we would say that God made LeBron James exactly as he is today as part of his plan from the very beginning. If it is true that LeBron James was made by God and is part of his divine plan from before the foundations of the world, we would have to say that God is the author, or at least knows about and governs the fates of each of the mutations that made up LeBron James' unique genome and our own genomes as well. However, I think that each of us would be really hard-pressed to identify, or I guess maybe you could say measure, how God has caused those changes to come about outside the context of describing them via probabilistic statistics. By this, I mean that we can mathematically describe the odds of a particular mutation occurring, and certain alleles like coming together from the parents of LeBron James to form the exact combination that makes his present-day genome. Our calculated odds of getting this exact combination that makes up the person of LeBron James would be, I think, extraordinarily small. Think less than the chance of winning the Powerball, lottery small. But we still would all agree that his unique combination of features could still have arisen via a multitude of small events, each of which we would clearly attribute to normal providence. So how does God control normal providence? In our example of inheritance, millions of genetic variants are recombined in our parents, and each of us gets some new combination from their variants, plus some new created by mutation, or changes that you could say that our parents didn't have. So we could look at LeBron James' genome and see the pathway of each particular variant and allele being passed down to him as a series of highly improbable events, and yet completely predictable in the sense that nothing about his particular set of variants appears to have been the result of any miracle, like a suspension of normal physical processes, right? Nothing about his particular set of genes should strike us as being impossible or out of the ordinary providential process that God has established for how organisms function on a day-to-day basis. Put it another way, it's like doing a random draw of a single ball from 1,000 balls, each of which is labeled with a different number, and you pick out the number 27. There was only a 1 in 1,000th chance of picking the ball out that had that number on it. But despite the small chances of that result prior to the random draw taking place, we would not immediately jump to the conclusion that a miracle had happened. Right? We would not suspect that the normal mechanisms of how the draw took place were not all in order and follow the normal progression of the way physical processes work in this world. More importantly, we really just wouldn't be able to identify the hand of God, right, in that final outcome, beyond making some just really generic claim about how God upholds his creation through secondary causes. Interestingly, might I suggest that we could propose that God's knitting needles were involved in the selection of that particular ball? Might we know from Scripture that the outcome was determined despite its apparent randomness and being the product of the providential workings of this created world nonetheless? After all, we see in Proverbs 16:33, the lot is cast into the lap, but its decision is from the Lord. What we're really talking about here is the question, how is the particular outcome from the Lord? And is it possible for us to see God's knitting needles in action? Is it possible to identify God's action in outcomes we observe? And can we point to those actions as proof of God's existence? I have to say that I feel that this is a futile exercise, and it's sending us in the wrong direction to look for God. And yet I feel like many Christian apologists wish to identify specific places where God is manipulating nature, or we might say intervening in his secondary causes, to produce us and some other creature, to build a proof for God's existence. This is the sense I believe some Christians have when they say they believe that the world is designed. They want to see the great odds against a particular result as proof that God must have been involved in producing that particularly unlikely result. We could say that many Christians wish, or they even demand, to see God's knitting needles in action before they will believe that God really did it. Furthermore, there are whole groups of Christian apologists who seek to convince the non-believer of the existence of God by showing evidence of God's divine action. They believe they can demonstrate proof of God's knitting needles in action, which will drive the unbeliever to Christ. But what if God's knitting needles are indistinguishable from the processes by which non-theists accept are just part of nature and not evidence of special creation? What if a biologist can explain the specific combination of genetic variants in LeBron James' genome and can explain how each participates in the process of development from the first cell to the embryo to birth? Does this mean that God is not involved? Or might we say that the biologist has described God's knitting needles, just as the non-Christian meteorologist might describe how a series of events results in the formation of a rain cloud? Let's continue. Let's consider the question, did God predestine LeBron James to have his exact skill set? If so, he has been in charge of bringing every allele, every mutation together in his genome, and then guiding his life to use those gifts such that he would become who God planned him to be from before the foundation of the world. In order to get from Adam to LeBron James, does that require large-scale supernatural intervention, like miracles and creative acts? Does it require just tweaking, small-scale supernatural interventions? Although a small-scale supernatural intervention, I don't know how that would be different from a large-scale one. Or maybe it occurred by some kind of pre-planned changes, kind of like the pre-programming that Ken Ham and some other young earth apologists suggest when they suggest that God uploaded into the kinds of animals that he created at the very beginning of creation. And then after that information's been uploaded, the organisms kind of run like they have computer code over time, expressing the things that they've been pre-programmed with. If so, is this some form of predestination, or is this more like deism? Of course, this brings us to the question, what of free will actions of man? Did God foreordain that LeBron James would exist by planning for that existence from the beginning? Or did he only provide in mankind the capacity to produce LeBron James, a Ken Ham, a Donald Trump, you, me, simply by chance, uncontrolled events that occur after that original starting material has been made. In other words, was LeBron James a possible but not inevitable outcome of God's creation, based on the potential in the ancestral genome of mankind? Some Christians take the view, sometimes called open theism, and are inclined to believe that maybe LeBron James is the fortunate one who happened to get the exact combination of alleles as God let chance do the work. Yeah, I know, these are really tough questions, especially for one who is coming from a Calvinistic tradition. Let's try the same thought again, though, but let's put it in a different way. If God knew of LeBron James before the formation of the world, does that mean he installed in him the specific alleles, the variations of genes? Were they installed in Adam and Eve, or the parents, the common ancestor of all mankind? Were they installed there from the very beginning? And then LeBron James is merely one of the billions of intended consequences of that plan? Or does God potentially guide or decide every variation in order to individually craft the person he intended? This would also include even the new variants that come about via mutation in successive generations. We could call the former sort of a deistic approach, like all the information is there and there's billions of different options, and all those options play out in some form or fashion, but they're not pre-planned or predestined. That second option we could call, the sovereignty approach, that God's sovereign over his entire creation and all that happens. The third alternative, the open theism approach we just mentioned a few moments ago, that might posit that God's created the starting conditions of Adam and Eve, but doesn't really know the outcome exactly, and therefore LeBron James is just one possible but not inevitable outcome. Personally, I'm not inclined to accept this last option because I don't believe it comports with the clear teaching of scriptures that LeBron James, you, I, have been knit together in our mother's womb, and other passages that teach God's omniscience over his creation and history. Does that mean I've got the answer? Well, definitely not. But I believe there's common ground among most Christians regarding the origins of us and all living things. God formed LeBron James via some common ancestor, along with the rest of us at some point in the past. LeBron James himself was not formed via direct special creation or some miracle, but through special providence, sometimes called special governance of God's creation. But how God employs his upholding and making each individual is subject to a lot of discussion among Christian theologians, scientists, and philosophers. Now, another question worth exploring is how we might extend this understanding, or you might be thinking lack of understanding at this point, of how God has formed each of us individually to how God has created other living things. We might expect that God could have worked in a similar fashion, or is there something special about how he directs our lives versus other creatures? If we understand and agree that God worked through some combination of special or general providence, might we extend a similar approach to understanding how he might have knit together the other forms of life that we see and have seen over time? Now, here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to suggest that this knitting process is, in large part, the processes that we have elucidated via God's gift to us of self-discovery, or you might call the scientific process itself. When we discover how genes are expressed and interact to develop our physical bodies, we are discovering God's knitting needles. Many might not wish to ascribe those discoveries to God's action and give God glory for his general providence. But it might be that when God tells us that he knit us together in our mother's womb, that his authorship and upholding of the process that we're allowed to discover are, in fact, the descriptions of his knitting needles. I'm not sure anyone can adequately answer all these questions, integrating them into some fully consistent explanatory framework for how God accomplishes his purposes in the world today. But all Christians can agree that LeBron James exists and that God created him. So praise be to God for what he has done, even if we don't fully understand how he did it. Okay, that's the end of my prepared remarks. Now what I've done is I've just jotted down some quick topics, and I want to just start talking about them. I haven't prepared anything. I haven't written anything. I am just forcing myself to think through the topic of providence, governance, miracle, God's action, divine action, whether we can identify it or not, intelligent design, all those things in the context of a few different topics like continuous environmental tracking, natural selection, mutations, progressive creationism. Because I think that even though I'm not going to be able to articulate this well, and part of this exercise is me learning how to articulate things as I discuss them, is that I believe that most approaches to understanding the world around us and in any theistic sense involve grappling, even if we don't consciously do it, we're grappling with this question of God's divine action. Like, how does he work? You see, you have something like progressive creationism. In progressive creationism, you have God at different intervals during time. See, most progressive creationists are old earth creationists. They believe the world is very, very old, typically as old as any secular scientist would believe, for billions of years old. And during that time, God is progressively creating, progressively creating the living forms on earth. And he's sort of replacing one living form with another as the environmental conditions change. In other words, as the earth's geology is shifting and shaping, God is creating organisms that are adapted to those new environments. And eventually the world is sort of formed well enough that, and everything is good in the sense that it's ready for human beings. And then God creates human beings, Adam and Eve, and then places them in this world. Well, think about what divine action means there. Right? Typically what you have is you have a bunch of instantaneous de novo creations. Right? And I might be using a common design, meaning you have an organism that is, like it's got like apes, right? You got an ape-like organism or a particular species of ape. And then, I'm going to make another ape, right? And so I'm taking the basic pattern of that ape and then I'm going to add a few features. So presumably switching around some genes, adding a few new genes in, and then creating a new plan, which is the new species. Now, within that one species, what happens is you have it starts to divide, right? It starts to reproduce. You have a bunch of individuals. Those individuals have variation. So I don't know there's some things I don't know about what progressive creationists believe, but let's just say that that the original creation of any particular species, probably especially animals, might consist of a male and a female. And so then you have maybe different genetic variants in both. That creates a situation where you have variation within that species. When they reproduce, they produce offspring that have new combinations, and those new combinations then create slight variations in the offspring. And then most progressive creationists, as far as I understand, are accepting of natural selection as a process which shapes and adapts organisms or species to their local environments, using those different variations or selecting upon those different variations. And that there are mutations that exist. But what they say is that that's not sufficient. Like natural selection and mutations is not sufficient to create whole new properties that would distinguish those organisms from their past ancestors enough that we call them new species. And so that requires another, what we'll call it, an interruptive act, right? A point of supernatural creation. And so thinking about divine action, the divine action is very clear because it's more supernatural interventions that are occurring in the history of organisms. But what about what's happening in the actual organisms that the species that exist and as they propagate themselves and make new populations? How is God acting there? I think progressive creationists would probably take up a model that's general providence, right? That God is allowing the secondary causes of the world, the things that he has established as the way the world functions, in terms of natural selection and mutations occurring and so forth. And that those then are creating variation within that population and local adaptation and small changes to the species, but not so much that they become new species. And so they're essentially saying that God did not endow his creation with the capacity to fundamentally change themselves through his normal providence, right, through his general providence, or even, I could say, special providence. He did not endow the creatures with the capacity to change themselves to the point where they become new species. Right? That's a limitation. So I think they would say that God limits the capacity of change in the world by not giving them the mechanisms to be able to do that. Right? He's provided mechanisms for propagation and for having some changes, but hasn't provided mechanisms for doing more. That differs from, say, the theistic evolutionist or the evolutionary creationist who says that God has provided the ability in the general creation and the general providence, the general upholding of the natural laws, such that that one species becoming another is possible. Now, what I'm asking in this particular series is the further idea, which is, upholding completely directed in the sense that God knows and predestines the species, what species will become another species, what species they will become? Or is it simply that he has given enough features to the creation that it will allow for all these different possibilities, right? And then open theists and others will say that he takes those possibilities and then works with those possibilities. Now, what does works with those possibilities mean? How does he actually operate in accomplishing his purposes? Because we have that idea of God is working all things right out. And so that is kind of at the nub of what we're asking here is how is he actually working things out? And I'm kind of interested in, is it possible to see how those things are worked out? See, I think some Christian thinks we can actually see the hand of God, right? If we study things enough, we'll be able to find those little points and places where all of a sudden I can't explain why this particular thing happened. This doesn't seem possible. That this must be the area that God tweaked something and moved it, right? And so that fits into this profile of progressive creationism fairly well. God's here hanging around, kind of giving little input, little nudges to things to push things in certain ways, but isn't necessarily determining the outcome of every single event, right? He's just tweaking important events to get the overall picture of what he wants. So there is sort of a form of predestination in the sense that here's my goals, right? Here's what I intend for creation to make and for what to happen. But I'm not controlling every single possible event. Now, as soon as you say that, you realize that others will say that that defies the principle of theology, principal idea of sovereignty. That God isn't fully sovereign, right? He's only partially sovereign in that particular case. So let's apply this to some other creationist ideas, right? What about continuous environmental tracking? Right, continuous environmental tracking is this concept that's been derived by Randy Gugliuzza and friends at the Institute for Creation Research. So they're young Earth creationists. So they clearly believe in special creation, that God is instantaneously and abruptly creating like all different types of life forms and creating the earth in an exceptionally short period of time, if not instantly. And so that's definitely divine action. And they would say that we can see that action. Well, actually, we don't see that action. We just see the product of that action. Actually, we just see the scriptures telling us or being interpreted to say that that's what happened. And then they try to show that there's evidence in the world that there was an abrupt beginning, right? Things like the creation orchard. They'll say a bunch of these species look like they're related to each other by common ancestry. So therefore, God has created common ancestors, which then can change over time. And we just talked about that. LeBron James and you and I are not all the same, right? And yet if we have a common ancestor, and so there has been changes that have occurred over time through generations that has formed us. Now, we're not different species. We're all the same species. So that's variation still within one kind. Young Earth creationists go a little farther and say that you can have like the beginning kind, which then branches off into coyotes and wolves and domesticated dogs and hyenas, well, not hyenas, African wild dogs and foxes, right? And say that all of those are contained in one kind. So, sorry, got away from the continuous environmental tracking. I'm talking more broadly about creationist views. And actually, let's talk about answers in Genesis a little more, and then maybe we'll come back to continuous environmental tracking. So you have this branching out. Well, how did the branching happen? That's the same question I'm asking here that I've just asked in my prepared comments. How did the branching occur? You started with a set, all right? You start with a common ancestor. You could say that God infused in the common ancestor like a bunch of instruction sets, and it just kind of plays out like, okay, everything is encoded there, and everything that happens after that is designed to happen in a particular way. Already foreknows what the future is, and he packaged all the information in there to make all those things happen. And there's only really one possible outcome. I mean, I guess that would be kind of that would be a very extreme viewpoint, I think. And I don't think many creationists believe that. But on the other hand, I don't see many writing and answering the question that I'm posing here, which is, how is God acting in that process of speciation? Answers in Genesis believes that you have genetic variation. That variation is shuffled, right? Each time you have a mating pair produce an offspring, they're going to shuffle their genomes, recombine them in a new offspring. That offspring then has a unique combination. That unique combination then is expressed in the world as different physical and behavioral features. And then of all the individuals that have different variants, they, I think, would agree that the environment, which is just the other organisms and the temperature and the sunlight and all the things around us, govern which of those particular combinations is most fit for that environment. So really, when you think about it that way, it's a very naturalistic thing, right? You're saying, where is, the fundamental question is, where is God in that process? Right? It's like, okay, well, the original variation's there. We're gonna claim that God made that original variation. Well, then it gets shuffled. Well, how's it shuffled? Once again, I would say, like, if you look at that shuffling process, it can be explained exactly how that happens. I can't predict what the outcome will be because there's billions upon trillions of options in that shuffling. But no one's surprised when you see, like, oh, here's all the combination you got. You don't look at that and go like, oh, I see that combination is impossible. And so therefore, there was some kind of direct intervention by God to say, like, oh, I need this particular combination, which couldn't happen from the parents. No, I look at every offspring, and I think if we looked at it closely enough, I would not be surprised if you could trace the particular variants from the offspring back to the parents, and you could see how, like, oh, well, this variant got, there's this thing called crossing over in chromosomes. This variant got crossed over in the parents' chromosomes, and so that two variants got hooked together or linked together, and then that particular chromosome got shared to the descendant, the offspring. And so I understand how those two alleles, those two genetic variants, are linked together, even though they weren't linked on the original parents' things, right? In other words, it's explained. You have a natural explanation for that. And then even if you have 100 unique mutations in the offspring, your child has 100 unique mutations that the parents don't have, you could still go back cell by cell and say, like, oh, I see in the sperm, I see where there's a particular mutation that was then given to the offspring. And then after the first cell was formed, there was a mutation in that first cell, and it was shared by all the cells in that next generation. And so you could identify where all 100 mutations are, and you could figure out where in time they occurred. And then you could ask yourself, how did they happen? Well, we know of many different mechanisms for that. And if you had a videotape and you watched that particular chromosome, it's very likely you could see in the replication process, the enzyme that's replicating the DNA pulled out the wrong letter and put it in the wrong spot. Now, you can keep digging further and find the exact source of that error, But then you'll ask yourself at the end of the day the question, well, was that just random and there's no control behind that? Like God had nothing to do with that. God didn't know that was going to happen. He just knows that there's going to be mutations because he created a system that won't perfectly copy everything. And therefore, mutations will happen, and they happen at a particular rate. So 100 mutations will happen, but they're random with respect to what we can see. And the question becomes, are they random with respect to what God sees? Does God know exactly what the mutations are? Did he foreordain what the mutations are? Or does he simply know the mutations as he watches them happen, right? That's not a really good way of putting it. I don't know really how to draw that distinction. Or open theism, God creates the system, which then creates mutations, doesn't know exactly what mutations will occur, but when they do occur, God uses those mutations and says, like through the natural selection process, and those individuals will survive better and have offspring. And so he's using the results of changes to move organisms forward. All right, so let's scroll it back a little bit. We're back to, we're getting right down to the nitty gritty of like, how does new variation made? And is that variation is under God's complete sovereign control? Or is it somehow outside of God's control? And from our perspective, you can't really answer that question. That's kind of what I'm saying about his knitting needles. I guess if God's knitting needles are embedded in the process of all things that we can actually study and we can describe, and I can describe where those mutations happen and how they happened, and I can describe all the different variants and how they got mixed together. So I can explain how this individual now is formed from these prior two individuals. I can remove any sort of miraculous intervention. And all I'm left with is, this looks like what a non-Christian and a Christian would agree. Here's the process that caused that to happen. And the Christian might say, like, God's underpinning that. He's upholding creation, allowing it to happen. So it's a secondary cause. He's acting through his secondary means of creation, but not through direct action. So is that what Answers in Genesis is doing? I guess so. I guess they're saying really that God isn't, that he is using secondary means only, right, after the creation. And so he's allowing natural selection to do the choosing. Now, here's where Institute for Creation Research gets pretty upset, right? Because Randy Guglielmo and others at ICR, they want to deny natural selection because they are suggesting that what I just said makes it sound like natural selection is a force, right? Something apart from God. Like that we're saying that natural selection chooses which variants in a species or in human beings, which variants give the best fitness for that particular organism in that particular environment. And therefore they survive and then share those with their offspring. And that changes the organisms over time. So what you're doing is you're now ascribing the changing process to this sort of force, this mystical force. That's what Randy Guglielmo calls it. He calls it a mystical force that's happening here. I think he's wrong about that because, he's wrong for a variety of scientific reasons, but I think he's wrong because if God's ordained means of special providence, right, or general providence is to use the process of natural selection because it's part of his creation. He made natural selection, right? He made the fact of natural selection to be true because of the way he made organisms to operate. Because really, if you just ask where natural selection comes from, it's just the natural outcome of if there's variation, if the variant makes it an organism more or less fit in the particular environment, and if that organism has more offspring because they have that particular variant, then it's inevitable that this thing we call natural selection will happen. We'll see it play out and do something. That's just, a process that God has established via all the other things that He has created about how organisms operate. But ICR wants to say that that's a mystical force, and you're taking away from God, right? You're not allowing God to be the process. You're not acknowledging God. Well, if you acknowledge God as the author of natural selection and the author of the natural processes that organisms obey, right? And the fact that they have variation, and that variation is the result of the way the organisms operate, right? If that's the upholding of creation through God's secondary processes, then you're not taking away from God. And you're not saying that natural selection is a mystical force. You're saying it is the thing that God is using, right, to accomplish His purposes. Now, the non-Christian, the non-theist is not going to, worship God through that process or claim that process as being God's mechanism. I wouldn't expect them to. Right? So, but Reina Gulioza just needs to properly give credit, all right, to what God has done, rather than sort of allowing the non-theist to define things as like, well, this is the thing that makes it, as if since we describe something else that causes adaptation and we're not ascribing it to God, well, then we're taking God away and we're saying that God can't be involved. They're almost like giving it away. The ICR is kind of like accepting that they're right, and saying, no, you don't have a full understanding of the true significance of this process. They kind of admit they're right, and they're looking for another option. They're looking for another explanation for how God can be involved in this process more. See, that brings me back to divine action. How is God more involved in the process than, say, what Answers in Genesis view is, that God is hands off? What does ICR mean by that? I think I can give you an idea. I'm on their website. I'm just going to read a blurb under their continuous environmental tracking, an engineered-based biological model. What does ICR think, in Gulioza in particular, think that their role is? What do they think that they're creating and generating? He says, our task is to fundamentally change the way people understand biology by constructing a completely new theory of biological design that incorporates recent discoveries and respects the biblical narrative. Respects the biblical narrative? I would say deep underneath there, and I'm not sure Gulioza has really dug that far into his own soul to figure out what he really believes about this, but he probably has some gut feeling about what divine action is. And if he's not right about that, okay, that very difficult thing to identify, then he's building something on divine action that isn't necessary. Al, with the goal of igniting a second creationist revival. Right? He thinks that he's beginning a new revival in creationist research. That he's going to upend not just all of secular biology. He wants to upend all of creationist biology and put it back on a firmer foundation. He's one-upping Ken Ham on all this. The Institute for Creation Research has created an engineering-based model, which they call continuous environmental tracking, to explain the biological function of adaptation. Right? Organisms have behaviors and actions that result from the purposeful arrangement of parts. So you say, like, organisms, their behaviors and actions are the purposeful arrangement of parts. An organism is composed of lots of different components, right? And when all the components function together, yes, they create behaviors and they create actions. I am making actions right now, and I have particular behaviors, and that's a component of all the different parts that I have. And this is the typical intelligent design argument, right? That only an intelligent designer could have put those parts together, and he had a purpose in mind behind those. That's fundamentally distinct from the operation of the individual parts themselves. Now you're saying, so there's something more to the combination of parts rather than the parts themselves. The whole is more than the parts. Yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of individual cells. No individual cell can do the thing that my hand can do. But all the cells come together and they can do things that a hand can do, all right? So the sum of all those parts is much greater. All right, this is tantalizing in terms of just the generic way this is put. So it's like intuitive to, I think, the listeners of ICR and creationist. There are indications that essentially everything, molecules, parts, systems, about a creature functions not for a single purpose, but for multiple purposes. Their innate capacities derived solely from a creature's internal systems. So the key here is he's saying that everything an organism does is generated by some internal part, an innate capacity solely driven from internal systems. So it's the internal system that causes us to do things and act certain ways and behave. Again, that sounds kind of intuitive, I think, to most people. The continuous environmental tracking is a new model that flows from the latest findings in molecular biology, identifying innate systems and logic mechanisms that direct targeted responses to environmental challenges. Living creatures are active, problem-solving entities that continuously track changing environmental conditions and through their systems adapt themselves over time to fit existing niches or fill new ones. Let me unpack that a little bit, if I can. This is me trying to understand continuous environmental tracking right in front of you right now, because I have spent a lot of time reading their material, talking to others about this, listening to other people talk about continuous environmental tracking, and it's really hard to get a handle on what they really think is happening here. It's very generic, fluffy language, but what are the nuts and bolts? What's actually happening? What is the knitting needles of continuous environmental tracking? What is the action that's actually happening here? Let me read that again. Living creatures are active, problem-solving entities that continually track a changing environmental conditions. And then their innate systems, the things they already have inside them, that are purposefully there, they are purposefully adapting themselves over time. So it's like an organism sees or is in an environment and they see a change in the environment. And they go, I need to adapt to this new environment. It's a lot hotter. Oh, inside I've got this innate system, right? I've got this intricate engineered components that God has given me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on one of those new components, something I wasn't using before, and now I'm going to turn it on, or I'm going to readjust my own, I'm going to readjust my operating system, and I will adapt to that changing environment. Right? I think that's what they're saying here, because he's saying living creatures themselves, not populations, he's talking about individuals, are active problem-solving entities that continuously track the environment. I'm continuously tracking the temperature, and as I do so, I adapt myself to that temperature. And it's all through my innate systems. And so I better fit my niche, right? Right. But now, how do I pass that down on to my kids? This is the thing that I've yet to hear from Institute for Creation Research is, okay, so I somehow turned on different systems. How do I pass that information on to my kids? They'll talk about epigenetics, but epigenetics at the end of the day can't solve everything, especially since different species have sometimes different genes and they have different alleles and variants. Where the variants come from, how do they get past one generation to another? And how do one variant get associated with the changes that an individual has made? Right? I don't see the connection there. Engineers must design all capability into an entity. He's talking about things that are engineered, right? Cell phones or something. So biological design theory would be internalistic, meaning that identifiable control systems that are innate to organisms will govern both organismal form and adaptability. So it's the own systems of the organism. Explanations of biological phenomena are restricted to objective engineering causality. This precise way to explain biological functions doesn't omit a system element between exposure and response. Okay, let's forget that. Their final goal is to move toward an explanation of adaptation as though Darwin had never propagated his theory. We're going to pretend like Darwin never existed, and we're going to just make up a whole new theory so that it's not at all dependent on Darwin. It's like, does he realize that if Darwin never existed, we'd still have evolutionary theory that is based on natural selection and mutations, because others would have come up with those same ideas. And others did, right? Because there's Wallace, who came up with the same ideas about natural selection. Can't really act as if Darwin never existed. And you also can't act as if there's a whole field of other things beyond Darwin and kind of go back. But a non-Darwinian framework obviously rejects selectionism. Okay, because Darwin came up with selection, a non-Darwinian framework would have to not have selection in it. Profound, right? ICR's biological model, continuing environmental tracking, is both design-based and organism-focused. Right? We're not focused on this mystical force out here, which is then causing organisms to change. We're saying organisms change within themselves. They look at the environment and they change themselves. Well, this is the fundamental difference between, do individuals change, do individuals evolve, or do populations evolve? I think it's pretty clear that populations evolve. Organisms have many, many offspring. I don't see ICR coming up with any evidence that an organism has 100 offspring, and you put 100 offspring in a new environment, and all 100 offspring adapt and evolve themselves, right? Change themselves. They don't continuously environmentally track every single one of them, and they all become somehow adapted to that new environment. What we observe, the observational science, right? What we observe is you have 100 offspring for some animal. They have 100 offspring, and they're in a new environment. Some of them do better in that environment. Some do worse in that environment. Some do okay in the environment. And some individuals have more offspring because they're better adapted to the environment. They're getting resources better. And some organisms don't get resources at all and die off. If they all had this great engineering ability, if they all had this adaptability that was built in because God gave them the instruction set, because ultimately this is what Giglio is going to say, God designed these organisms with all these sort of intricate engineering principles, hidden programs that aren't being expressed now, but in the future, when the environment changes, they'll use those programs, turn them on. That's another mystery of this whole thing. And then they'll be able to adapt, right? God has in this case, God's foreordained this because God has seen into the future, or known the future, because he's through all time. He knows that there is a changed environment coming up, and he's already pre-adapted, pre-created the engineered set of things in that organism that would allow it to adapt and change the individuals to that new environment. The thing is, we don't observe that. We just don't observe that. We observe in offspring a reshuffling of variation. Those new variants then are exposed to new environments, and some of those variants function well and some don't. If God had designed everything to change, then we would expect all of them to have that capability. Okay, but I was trying to keep this to what is the divine action here? And I think my summary here for continuous environmental tracking would be something like, to me, CET sounds like pre-programming, and then God kind of steps back and it's like, I've put everything in there, everything's ready to go, and it just kind of plays out over time. And that God isn't directly involved. He's not completely sovereign in this process in the sense of being intimately involved in upholding every single step along the way and choosing every single end result. Let's say let's go to answers in Genesis. Nathaniel Jeanson and others have proposed something called created heterozygosity and natural selection. So that's the idea that God created heterozygotes. That just means you have multiple variants of genes in Adam and Eve. And then natural selection. So they're pretty much admitting and saying that that you have individuals with variation. They reshuffle. They create a whole bunch of offspring. Some offspring have different variants that work better in future environments. And therefore, natural selection selects those particular individuals, which then shape the individuals over time. And so natural selection is the process that actually causes changes or adaptation in the environment. In the Answers in Genesis way. Now, how do they think that God is active in that natural selective process? That's what I'd really love to have a deep conversation with with somebody from Answers in Genesis about. I'd love to see them write about this. I'd love to see them try to ask and answer the question about God's divine action. Is every single species that is formed from the ark, are they all preordained exactly what God had planned from the very beginning? Or are they simply all just a number of the different possibilities that could have happened? And so what is God's nature in terms of acting in that process? And could we see the process? I mean, is there any point where you could say, I can specifically identify that God has caused this to happen? I don't think that Answers in Genesis will say that we could see that. I think that they're kind of be right in there with my own description earlier of the knitting needles being the more we understand how biology works, the more we just understand how God's knitting needles work. Right. And when we fully understand how biology works, we'll actually pretty much fully understand how God's knitting needles work. I think Answers in Genesis actually is probably okay with that particular explanation. This is a really difficult topic. And it makes people squirm because it's kind of self-contradictory at times. The more something is sovereignly controlled, the less free will there seems to be. But you want to have some free will because you don't want to have God being, you don't want everything in the world to just be robotic. There is absolutely, everything is preordained in the sense that there is nothing you can do to change the trajectory of what happens. Nobody wants to feel like that's the case. So you have free will. Well, and there's theological justification for believing there is a form of free will. And so some people want a lot of free will, right? And they want it to be free will in the sense also of all organisms having free will, or God isn't in complete control of all the things that happen to them. But then we run into sticky problems. I think I better stop. I'm just going to start going in circles, because that's what happens when you talk about free will and sovereignty. You end up talking in circles at times. It's a super complex topic. I'm simply trying to highlight it's an important topic to at least try to grapple with. Because I believe at the end of the day, many of the core differences between models of biological evolution or progressive creationism or creation orchard or whatever your way of thinking about how God has formed the diversity of life on earth, I think that there is some core differences between people's ideas about free will and sovereignty that underlie some of those basic models. And so this is one of the reasons why it's hard for people to move probably from one model to another, or just have a scientific model and use the evidence they see to try to support, to look at the evidence and ask which model is best supported by the evidence, because they are fundamentally bound by some really deeper, deep set beliefs that I think many people might not even realize they have, but they're there, right? They're at the core of their theology. And so theology of, Calvinists, Arminians, open theists, and so forth, all these different ideas that are out there about God's action and divine action and how he functions in this world. All of those things filter down into these particular ideas, making some of the differences between these core concepts that Christians disagree about in terms of biological evolution. So I'll say one other thing. I'll just, and this is, again, off the top of my head, so don't hold me to this last 20 minutes, right? This is me kind of trying to grapple with this question, trying to apply it to creationists, different kinds of creationists. But I'll say that if you have a view of God's knitting needles, or a view that you're not going to be able to see God's divine providence and see God, how he works all things to good. You can't identify and actually show like this is where God acted right there. Partly because I think God's acting everywhere, and so for me, that's not something you're like point out. This is where God works, because as soon as you say, "Oh, right there, that's where God did something right there," I can see that. You're kind of saying that God didn't do those other things, right? You're kind of falling into the trap of all these other things are just natural processes, and by saying natural, you're kind of being outside of God's control. You might, at the end of the day, you might be sophisticated enough to try to think through and think like they're not natural in the sense of not having anything to do with God, because God is upholding nature and upholding the laws of the universe, and that is allowing all the things that happen, the interactions between matter to happen in particular ways. And so all those things are via the upholding of God's word. But for many Christians, that's not satisfying. That's not enough. Like I said before in my scripted comments, they're looking to try to like see God's knitting needles, to see where God acts specifically, because they want like that confirmation. Like, I can see God where he did that. This idea that that a non-Christian, a non-theist can describe something about how something occurs, like the interaction of different molecules and so forth. And it's like putting all the pieces together and saying like, I can explain exactly how all this happens. And I didn't have to use the word God one time, right? It's like the weatherman who, can understand how cold fronts and warm fronts come together, and they're going to create this rain, and they can project things based on that. They don't have to use the word God. They don't have to attribute any of that to God. They don't have to say that God is upholding all the different natural laws, and the reason why rain forms is because cold and moisture and blah 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 all work through these different laws that are via God's good grace upholding. They don't have to say that. They could say that, I think. But they don't have to say that in order to explain it in some naturalistic sense. And that seems to be okay for most people, explaining like stuff about geology and weather patterns and the atmosphere and so forth. For some reason, we don't get so upset about that. When you start to describe biology and you start to talk about intricate systems and how they change and how species are made and so forth, all of a sudden Christians feel like they have to find like the moment God is making something happen. Like I need to know like that this can't be explained by somebody else. Like, how many times have you heard like, oh, science can't explain this, right? Science can't explain this. And the implication is, well, then God, but that's because God did that. And so science can't explain things that God specifically did, like first cause did, not second cause did. And so we'll kind of play lip service to like, oh yeah, there's secondary causes. So, we can explain some things because he allows the world to interact in ways that non-Christians and Christians can both see. But we're so tempted and so desiring to like find God in the process. We try to like force him in there at times. Rather than just acknowledge that maybe it's okay to be able to say that these biological systems can be explained through thoroughly natural processes, and this species becoming another species. You didn't need to bring in any extra explanations. It all still fits underneath the providence of God. It still all fits within his natural setup of how the world functions and how he upholds it. And so how far can you go with that? I mean, of course, that's the question. Like how much can you explain of all biology? All common ancestry, only some species. That's where you're going to get big divisions among different Christians, because they have other philosophical assumptions and philosophical underpinnings that require them, or interpretations of Scripture that require that even though they might acknowledge that could happen, it didn't happen because I believe the Scriptures tell me this. But that's different than saying it couldn't happen because I just don't believe it could happen, because it's impossible. See, I think even some young earth creationists can acknowledge that, yeah, evolutionary processes could actually make all eukaryotes from a basic eukaryote, right? All organisms with nuclei. They'll say that didn't happen, but they would acknowledge that, yes, God's knitting needles, the things that he has proclaimed and deemed to be the actions that molecules can take, and the process of natural selection, and the fact that mutations happen, and all these different things. If you had enough time and you had the circumstances in the environment, the natural selective circumstances, everything is explainable, right? Within this by naturalistic processes. But you can still say that's all upheld by God and part of God's plan. But those young earth creationists would say, sure, that could have happened. Like that's possible. It's possible to happen. But we know it didn't happen because we know the world's not that old. And so therefore, and we know that God said that he created these things separately. That's different than, say, Answers in Genesis, which tries to prove scientifically, trying to say from the evidence, that's impossible, right? And so the fact that organisms look like they're different kinds and not related to each other, according to them, is evidence that proves that the Bible is right. They want to start with the Bible and say that we already know this, but they also want to tell the rest of the world, the non-theist, look, you can actually see that this can't happen. And since it can't happen, you need to throw away your belief that it can't happen and ask yourself, why does the world look that way? What the Bible actually kind of explains it. And so maybe you ought to think about, trusting the Bible. I think, even though I'm a Christian and a theist, that is not a very good approach, because I do think that the evidence suggests that there is the possibility that God's knitting needles are powerful enough. Okay? God's knitting needles are powerful enough to create a variety of different organisms from a common ancestor given enough time, because time is part of that knitting needle process. And so to just say that that's not possible is to actually deny the power of God's knitting needles. It's to say that we think God's knitting needles are actually pretty ineffective. They're pretty weak. They can only go so far, right? They couldn't have done these things. In other words, God did not create a world that can actually express all these different forms of life through secondary causes. And so we want to sort of limit that action and not allow it to express itself that way. All right, I'm going to start repeating myself if I say much more. But all this has been me, kind of a stream of consciousness, thinking through this process of how to think about God's divine action and how it relates to young earth creationists, intelligent designists, and so forth. All right, I hope this is helpful and maybe stimulating. I know that there's not anyone who's watching this that won't disagree with something I've said. And I'll go back and listen and think, yeah, I shouldn't have said that. I disagree with what I just said, or I had this thought and I thought about it a little more and yeah, that doesn't really work. But that's part of the learning process, right? That's part of the process of engaging your mind to explore these topics. And even somebody who's not a theist, what I'm trying to also do for you is to help you have an appreciation for what some of these complex topics are, even within theism, and maybe try to understand why certain people think certain ways, even within the broad world of Christendom. All right, I'm gonna stop it there. So, LeBron James, a product of divine action. I just don't know exactly how that divine action happened. All right, thanks a lot. Talk to you later. Oh yeah, subscribe, hit like, that kind of stuff too. Always forget to say that. Bye.